Good afternoon. Welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar at Purdue University. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Kovah. Xeno is a senior information security engineer at the MITRE Corporation, and he received his master's degree from CMU in 2007. And Xeno has been doing research on rootkits, and that's what he's going to talk about today.
Thank you. Hi. So, trying to provide hopefully a little bit entertaining presentation today. First thing, my slides are going to be available afterwards, and I generally license my stuff as open source, so you can copy them and reuse them if you see fit, although most of the stuff in here is just copied from other people's slides, so you won't necessarily have any reason to copy anything I have. Because this presentation was actually made on my own time, I'm just delivering it on MITRE's time. We have a standard disclaimer, which is good, saying that MITRE is not, all of the opinions and stuff I'm going to give you today are my own opinions. They're not to be construed as MITRE's opinions, and that's good because I'm going to start out with one hypothesis and one opinion.
Could you raise your voice a little bit?
Talk a little louder? Sure. I can move this closer. So, the hypothesis here, and the reason why I say that rootkits are lame, is I believe that rootkits are fundamentally fairly easy to detect when you actually, study their techniques that they use and you dig into what things people actually use in the wild. And so, while rootkits may actually be fairly easy to detect, the problem here is that it doesn't actually matter if they're easy to detect if we don't have good tools out there to help real users detect them on their systems. So in particular, my bias here is going to be real corporate users. The problem is actually a bit more difficult when we talk about home users. So when you go to have to help out your mom or your grandma or something like that, and they say, we think we have some malware, dealing with that situation is actually much harder than dealing in enterprises. And I'm more concerned with enterprises because we have many machines and there's a lot more valuable information on them that needs to be protected. So just so that we have agreement upon terms here, we have to talk about what a rootkit is for purposes of this talk. There can be lots of definitions for what a rootkit is. It's a very overused term. You'll see everything from ATM rootkits at the most recent Black Hat to Java rootkits to your just traditional user mode, kernel mode, OS rootkits, database rootkits, etc. So the key thing to know is that rootkits are attacker tools. It's a type of malware, and it's not actually how an attacker gets root or breaks into a system. For purposes of this talk, when we say rootkit, we mean the software which someone brings along after the fact when they've compromised a system to hide their presence on the system. So if you go and look out there over the history of rootkits, you'll see varying definitions. Back at the beginning, they were actually kits of tools. They weren't just one thing. But to the point where they've specialized and evolved today, we really just consider it whatever specific malware is being used to hide the rootkit. To hide the attacker's presence on the system. So I'm going to organize this talk around what's called the stealth malware taxonomy. It was put out by Joanna Rutkowska, a rootkit researcher, around 2006. So it's a little old, actually. Rootkit stuff has been developing over the last few years, so I updated a little bit, but the key point here is that she categorizes stealth malware in general, not just, so to get away from the notion of having to find what a rootkit is or isn't, she defines stealth malware. So that means you can have malware which is trying to hide from someone, but you wouldn't necessarily consider it a rootkit according to traditional definitions. And so type 0 has to do with malware which is using legitimate system features to hide. So, I'll go into some examples of each of these types a little later. But so type 0, it's not actually changing anything in the system. It's just using whatever capabilities have been built into the system, and it's basically abusing them for malicious intent. So, any capability built in the system, it can be used maliciously or not. And so stealth malware type 0 is abusing legitimate functionality. Type 1 has to do with modifying things which should be static. So sometimes in order to achieve an attacker's goal, they're going to have something which shouldn't actually be changing, which when they change it, that helps enable their hiding on the system. So we'll go into examples of that as well later. Type 2 so the problem with type 1, as you'll see, is when an attacker is changing something static, a defender can come along and say that shouldn't be changing, and then they can, detect that someone's changed it. So type 2 has to do with the evolution of malware more towards taking things which are naturally dynamically changing and modifying those as well, because things that are naturally changing are much harder for a defender to come along and say that shouldn't change, because it should change. So that's an evolution. And type 3, when she first proposed this taxonomy, she was saying it was things outside of the operating system, and specifically she was thinking of her recently developed virtualization rootkit, so where you're having a malicious hypervisor virtualizing an OS. There's theoretically, according to her, there was no way that anyone in the OS could detect this thing which is outside, right? That's why we have things like virtual machines. When you use VMware, you assume the malware can't get out, right? There's this virtualization separation. So under that notion, type 3 are things which exist outside of the operating system. It can be hypervisor, but nowadays with advances in proposals for rootkits, we'd say it can be anything from a hypervisor to an external malicious network card to some various more advanced things we'll talk about later. So we're going to kind of organize around these concepts. So example of type 0 malware, we said these are the things which just abuse legitimate capabilities on the system. These can be things like spyware, trojans, or bots. You can think of something like a DDoS bot. Before we had really botnets, you called them zombies, and they were just a thing which someone had on their system, and it would just send a bunch of packets to one target, and as long as there's a bunch of machines all sending packets to that one target, you get a distributed denial of service attack. So that is the ability of a system to just connect to another system. That's not a malicious capability, but when you organize it in such a way that you have thousands of these things doing it all at once, the ability to connect becomes an attack capability. So type 0 malware just leverages existing capabilities, and a lot of the times when it comes to actually hiding, a valid technique can be to just hide in plain sight. That means they'll just name themselves like a Microsoft binary, name themselves like some third-party software, and they'll just assume, well, when someone's going through the quick listing of what software is on this system, they're going to see, well, this one looks like it's Microsoft C service or something like that, and the administrator doesn't necessarily know what any given service really does, and they may be named very similar to other things. So you can oftentimes malware just hides in plain sight under the assumption that defenders don't actually know what's in their system in the first place, and therefore they're not noticing these things as long as it looks basically like something that should be there. So it's worth noting that in that 2006 paper, type 0 was out of scope for the taxonomy. She basically said that's antivirus's problem. That's the traditional sort of malware. They're already dealing with that as your traditional security products deal with this type 0 malware. But just to list, the basics of the approaches that a defender may take in order to find type 0 things. You have blacklisting. That's just virus signatures. You say, if I find this this chunk of code, this specific binary signature, that must be bad software. You have whitelisting. Obviously, the opposite. That's the file system integrity checking, more of what I'm listing there. Whitelisting is just saying, well, instead of trying to list all of the bad stuff on our system, we'll list all of the good stuff. And there's a classic thing from Purdue, Tripwire, which is a very old file system integrity checker, which just says, administrators need to go look at what files exist on their system, and if someone changes those, and if it wasn't, due to an update, for instance, that they did patches, then that's potentially malicious. So that's another way that you can detect when type 0 malware has gotten onto a system. And then there's other things trying to do behavioral analysis. And this is sort of a very heuristic-based kind of thing, so I'm not going to really go into it, but, well, I won't go into it, as I just said. So the question is, why is type 0 malware going undetected right now? So the fact is that, malware infections are pervasive throughout, home users, enterprise users, systems. And so my opinion here, the reason why type 0 stuff is going undetected is because companies have overly invested in blacklisting technologies called like antivirus things. It's a trite but true thing that people say, antivirus is useless. And some people want to just get rid of all antivirus, but that's not necessarily a good thing either, because then you expose yourself to all the back catalog of malware. But the fact is that malware is extremely polymorphic nowadays, thanks to packers and things like that, where you don't have to build the polymorphism yourself. You just have a generic application. You feed it another application. It adds some randomizing wrapper, which subsequently means that antivirus signatures become much harder to generate for that malware. And then another important thing is the whitelisting approach, which had been proposed long ago. Like I said, Tripwire is fairly old, and they've got their own company as well. But I feel like one reason why whitelisting technology is not widely used is because the operators within companies and places like that, the whitelisting technology requires some knowledge about what is on the system right now, and it requires keeping track of all the updates that take place. Every time Firefox pushes out a new thing, your operators have to know that new software is legitimately being deployed to end systems. And so whereas something like blacklisting can be one size fits all, it's the antivirus's problem, they give me signatures, I run them. Whitelisting puts more onus on the administrators to know what's on their systems. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's you have to know more about your environment. You have to exert more work in order to understand the baseline of what should or shouldn't be there. And so I believe that's what's traditionally been behind the poor adoption of whitelisting type things. And but I think that's going to start changing due to this polymorphism that I've mentioned. So some examples of type 1 malware. So going back again, we said type 1 is malware which changes something on the system which, for all intents and purposes, should never actually legitimately change. It's causing an integrity compromise. So here's an example from a Black Hat rootkit presentation. This is describing what's called an import address table hook. Over here on this side, you can just pretend this is any binary. It could be Windows, could be Linux, but all binary formats have some mechanism by which they import functions from external libraries in order to call that function. So if you're going to call printf in your function, you're importing it from some other library, some standard C library, wherever. How those are actually represented internal to the binary is this little, whatever it is, blue thing right here. We're going to call that the import address table. It's basically a table which says, here's the address of printf, here's the address of open file, etc. So it's a list of function pointers which point to these functions in external code. So whereas normally this function pointer should point at this some DLL, which has some code that you're trying to call, when a rootkit installs an import address table hook, they go to the import address table, they change the function pointer to point to the rootkit code. And this is sort of a traditional way in order to redirect control flow within a program. So the attacker gains control of the program when the program would have normally called something like printf. It goes to the attacker. Well, a better example is, think of something like a function trying to open a file. So if this import address table would have normally pointed to open file over here, by an attacker grabbing control at that point, they can say, well, my version of open file first checks, are you trying to open files that begin with _Xeno or something like that? If that's my thing, that I have a rootkit and I want to hide all the files called _Xeno, whatever, then my version of open file is going to check for that first. And so I'm redirecting control to me. I'm saying, check whether this is my thing. If it is my thing, I'm going to return, well, that file's not found, for instance. And so this is a common mechanism. It's called hooking, in order to hook in and grab control of the execution flow, and then after that you use that control of the program execution in order to use your hiding. So hiding files, hiding processes, etc. And so now I'm just going to go through a couple other things. So again, back to the point here. The reason why we would consider this a type 1 malware technique is because this import address table should not actually ever change after it's set up once. It's set up once when a program gets loaded into memory, gets filled in by the dynamic linker, and then after that it should never ever change again. And if it changes, that's bad. And so we can detect this type of thing by saying, well, you're not actually pointing at the open file, the real legitimate open file function that we know about. And so there's just a lot of variations on this common technique. So here, this is an inline hook. So you can ignore all of this right now. The point here is, if this table right here would have pointed to some function ntcreate file, for instance, if you would point to that function, then what an attacker will do, instead of putting, well, I'll talk about that next. What an attacker can do is just insert, for instance, a jump instruction. That jump instruction right here at the very beginning of the function will redirect to the attacker's code. And then again, they do that thing like, if you're creating a file, but you're trying to create a file in a folder that I control, my folder is _Xeno and you can't create a file in there, only I can, then it takes control of the program at this point. It jumps to the rootkit code, and then it does some checks, and when it's done, it jumps back to the original code. So this is an inline hook where you just literally change the instructions in line. But again, the code in this kernel or module right here, the code there should never actually be changing. This code is typically marked as read-only and executable, not writable, but attackers don't actually have to pay attention to those privileges. They just put their code in anyways and take control. And the exact equivalent right here of the inline address table hook is if in this table has a bunch of function pointers, and again the attacker can just go into there, change the function pointer to point to the attacker's code. So this is very common. So what you've already seen is two completely different examples where they're just reusing the same technique in order to redirect control flow. They'll either take a table that has function pointers and change the pointer, or for instance they'll change the actual code where the pointer points. So, and here this SSDT, sorry I didn't mention it, but it's the system service descriptor table. It's basically the system call table on Windows. The system call table is the means by which user code talks to kernel code in order to do something for it. So user code can't actually talk to devices, can't talk to the hard drive, can't talk to the network card. It has to talk to the kernel, who's going to talk to the physical devices. So on Windows or Linux or Mac or anything else, you have these standard operating system conventions whereby user space will call to kernel space and kernel space will do something, and they'll typically, the calling to kernel space will involve some table of functions which point somewhere in kernel space. So these techniques end up being applicable across operating systems generally, thanks to operating system norms. And another just miscellaneous type 1 attack is what's called a bootkit, or master boot record rootkit. And so this little slide is taken from a presentation I think was 2 years ago at Black Hat, talking about a bootkit, which basically this little flow right here shows you everything that happens before the operating system actually loads. So when you start up, the BIOS initializes hardware, etc. Then it reads what's called the master boot record off the first sector of the hard drive, and that basically just tells it where it's supposed to look for partitions and the partition bootloader. And so each of these steps is basically just chaining on each other until they eventually get to the point where they're ready to load a Windows kernel or a Linux kernel or a Mac kernel, etc. So this is just specifically the Windows boot process. It's going to look very similar but slightly different for Linux or Mac. What an attacker can do here, and what I think there's just some news in the last couple of weeks about an attacker in the wild doing this type of attack in order to compromise Windows 64-bit, Windows 7, things like that. What attacker can do here is, if they can write to that first sector of the hard drive, the master boot record, and write some of their own code in there, what they can do is basically bootstrap their code, will write some code to the next stage, and that will write some code to the next stage, and that will write some code to the next stage, and thereby they're keeping control of this boot process throughout the boot, so that ultimately, when you get from winload.exe to nt-kernel, they're in winload.exe, and they write some code to nt-kernel, so that the operating system is compromised before it's even loaded, essentially. And this is why this is being used for things like Windows 7. They want to turn off things like the binary signing, turn off things like PatchGuard, which prevents them from doing other things throughout the system. And so basically they're just bootstrapping themselves up through the system in order to make it so that when the system eventually loads, they've overwritten portions of the kernel in such a way that it changes the behavior of the kernel to allow them to do whatever they want. But again, I said they're writing code in each of these stages and bouncing along, and that writing of code, each of these things is basically very static, and it should not actually be changing. So this is again why I'm categorizing this as a type 1 thing. They're changing stuff that shouldn't actually change and therefore is theoretically detectable. So just for your own purposes, for fun, go get this Gmer product. I like this one. It's a free thing online. It's very good in digging deep into the system and finding a bunch of these type 1 malware, basically. And there's a lot of other things you can use. And so there's various things you can use, and well, I want to get to you can use these, but in reality it's hard to use them, so I'll talk about that in just a second. But so those are things you can use for detecting. In terms of actually preventing type 1 things, so you want to actually prevent someone from writing to something which shouldn't actually be written to. So Windows 64-bit versions have started to introduce something called PatchGuard. This is it's basically integrity checking the system in order to say no one should be writing to this area, therefore if I ever see anyone write there, blue screen. Okay, so that, for one, that stops certain types of malware which are not PatchGuard aware. If the malware doesn't know about this PatchGuard and they're just trying to port over their 32-bit rootkit to the 64-bit rootkit, when they go to install that import address table hook or that SSDT hook or that inline jump, when they do that, they're just going to crash the system and they will have not succeeded, right? Another thing that Microsoft uses this for is there's a problem with doing integrity checking in that legitimate software, your antivirus things, your host-based intrusion detection systems, they end up using a lot of the same techniques as rootkits in order to enable their functionality. So they change stuff that they shouldn't be changing either, and that sort of gets to be a problem because you can't tell, well, is this my antivirus which is overwriting the kernel, or is this malicious software which is writing the kernel? And it leads to ambiguity, and therefore Microsoft's trying to push the vendors out of using these unsupported techniques that are very similar to attacker techniques in order to, one, make the system more stable, two, make it easier to differentiate good software from bad software, etc. But there are some unintended consequences to this. If attackers can no longer just hook into things, then potentially they're going to be pushed in one direction or the other. They're going to either go to type 0, where they'll just be on the system and they'll just hide, or they may go to type 2, which are the more hard to detect versions. And this is in the references later. This was the example of x64 bootkit in the wild in the last couple of weeks. They were talking about that. And when it comes to preventing type 1 things, there are a number of academic research things which show mechanisms by which you can prevent things. So I pointed out Nickel here and VM Watcher on the previous ones as shout-outs to Purdue, because these are actually work that's been done at Purdue or in concert with Purdue professors. And so Nickel, for instance, assumes you have a virtualized system and you as the defender live outside of the operating system, and you look into the VM and you say, has anyone overwritten stuff within the VM? And the benefit of being outside the VM is that the attacker can't directly influence your results. But then you get into issues of what if the attacker can escape the VM and then start modifying you? Well, then you need other academic work which tries to prevent attacks on the hypervisor itself, and this HyperSentry one's going to be presented at, I think it's ACM CCS in the next month or so. I can't remember when. But researchers are, of course, continuing on with their trying to find ways to deal with malware on varying levels of assumptions. All right, so why are type 1? So I said wire type 0 going undetected, I said, well, some of the things that would be very helpful are not, one size fits all, therefore operators aren't using them. One of the reasons why I think type 1 malware is going undetected is because of all these things which I listed right here, for instance. Some of these are very good. Like I said, I like Gmer. Some of these are very good, but these are meant to be run on like just a single system. So these are more targeted at home users. But you could say they were targeted at home users if they weren't so difficult to understand the results, because home users aren't going to understand operating system internals in order to, oh, well, that's an IAT hook. Well, I'm infected. Home users aren't going to understand that. So these are sort of more targeted at experts who can then run them on a single system. And that's not useful to me if I want to detect rootkits throughout my systems. Then I have to find some means by which to run these single system applications throughout my enterprise. And then, as I said, there's the problem of needing deep system knowledge in order to interpret results, and the lack of this knowledge by some administrators. Definitely, it's the kind of thing where, if you've had a really good OS class, oh, okay, well, this all makes sense, but your average system administrator is not going to have that deep understanding. All right. So talking a little bit about type 2 malware. So again, going back, type 2 malware. So type 1 was they changed stuff that shouldn't be changed. Type 2 is changing stuff that is legitimately changing over time. So the two common techniques for this are called DKOM and CO. So DKOM, direct kernel object manipulation, was specifically developed by one of the people who was doing early work on rootkits, Jamie Butler, and he made the FU rootkit. And specifically, the people who were doing early work on rootkits, they could see they were making their rootkits, and they're saying, well, I'm doing this, but this is really detectable, and I know that people are going to detect me. They thought that, well, if I'm using this inline hooking, well, that's really easy to detect, and so, my rootkit's not going to work. And so in this DKOM paper that I cite, they're basically putting out a detector for the type 1 rootkits, and then they're saying, oh, but by the way, we developed a new technique that doesn't use this hooking and doesn't modify this static stuff. Yep, so that was Vice right there. And the other technique is kernel object hooking, and this is, it's sort of a generalization. The inline hooking that I sort of showed before, we'll just talk specifically about the case of that import address table. There was a list of a bunch of function pointers that are pointing to specific functions that perform specific actions. Kernel object hooking is sort of a generalization of this in the sense that in the kernel there can potentially be a bunch of objects which are dynamically allocated. So the code is just running along and it decides, oh, well, I need to send some new event from this chunk of software over to that chunk of software. I need to tell that chunk of software to call this function. So I'm going to create a structure, I'm going to stick a function pointer in it, I'm going to pass it over there, and that guy's going to pull it off the end of some queue, and he's going to go to call that function. So that would be a crude description of what you might call using callback functions. And callback functions are used pervasively throughout operating systems just for efficiency reasons. You don't want to necessarily just keep polling on something, keep asking, did you do this, did you do this? You just send it an object and tell it do this at some point whenever you get it. So potentially there are lots of data structures flying around in dynamically allocated memory throughout the Windows kernel or Linux kernel. And these have function pointers in them. And therefore, if an attacker can, knows that these objects have these function pointers and it's relevant to me, the attacker can just go ahead and replace those function pointers with their own so that that original function is not called before the attacker gets their chance to intercept it and say, well, let me check if you're trying to open my file, and if so, don't let you. So digging into those a little more, this is sort of the canonical example of DKOM. It's from that paper on Vice. So this is just sort of how Windows organizes its metadata about processes within the kernel. So the kernel has to juggle all the processes. And it has some data structures, and specifically there's these eProcess structures. And you can see down here at the bottom, they have a linked list which helps them find each other. You know, everything in this linked list, those are considered all the processes that are loaded right now. So what a DKOM attack would do is, if you want to actually hide your process from something like Task Manager, so you hit Control-Alt-Delete on Windows, you go to Task Manager, this attack is specifically trying to hide a process so that it doesn't show up in Task Manager. And what it does is it just takes that linked list and it modifies it to jump over this central eProcess that they're assuming we want to hide here. So they're saying, you know, the forward link of this one points to that guy and the backward link of that one points to this guy. And so now you may ask yourself, well, if you take a process out of the kernel's running process list, why does it still work? Why does it run? Why, you know, how does the kernel know about it? Well, the reason is because the kernel can actually potentially keep multiple lists with different information for different subsystems. And so this list right here is not actually the one which the kernel scheduler uses to decide who's going to run at any given time. This is just a different list which is used by things like Task Manager, you know, so other things can know about what processes are loaded. So removing something from this list makes it disappear from Task Manager, but it's still in the scheduler list, and therefore it's still going to run, and the attacker's code will still be running. So this is the canonical example, taking some linked list, removing some object from it, under the assumption that there's some other list somewhere else that actually does the thing you care about. So there's a similar attack on hiding, you know, loaded kernel modules. They all are in a linked list, and if you just remove the one thing, the kernel module is still in memory running, but it's not being shown up. And unfortunately, I don't have anything better to show you in terms of kernel object hooking other than these types of structures that I was talking about before. So, and even this one is not necessarily a great candidate for kernel object hooking, but it was the one that was used in the paper by the guy who talked about it first, so putting this out there. This is a DPC, a kernel DPC, deferred procedure call. So it's saying, like, at some point later, I want to call this function, this procedure, right? So I'm deferring it, I'll do it later. Create this structure, take this PK deferred routine, that's a function pointer. So basically, whatever address is right there, you're going to create this structure, you're going to fill in an address for some function, you know, open file, printf, whatever you want it to be. Fill in an address there, create the structure, put it on this list of KDPCs, and then later on the kernel is pulling things off of this list and it's executing whatever address happens to be in this deferred routine thing. So these are used, for instance, like when an interrupt occurs, you get a network packet. The network packet handler, you know, stops other interrupts for a while. So a network packet causes an interrupt on the CPU. It says, you know, okay, stop all the interrupts for a second. I got to process this. What it does is it just creates a KDPC, puts it on the list, and says, okay, well, guy who handles packets, you know, take the function which handles packets, throw that in there, and say, okay, well, I got a packet, so handle it later, and then it lets the CPU go and continues execution. So there's a litany of various structures throughout the Windows kernel where one could potentially overwrite function pointers in order to for the attacker to get control before some function gets called. All right. So on the issue of DKOM, that was that attack I showed, for instance, hiding processes from Task Manager, hiding loaded modules, etc. There's actually a lot of things, you know, I said this is something which is normally changing, this process list, you add and you remove processes, right? So that linked list itself is always going to be changing, you know, up and down, adding and removing. But there's actually a number of things which will detect DKOM type attacks on hiding processes and modules through something called cross-view detection. And that's basically just a fancy way of saying I'm going to look at something two ways, and if they both don't agree, then I'm going to alert on it. And so I said before, there's a kernel scheduler list. That's the one that actually says you run, now you run, now you run. Okay? Kernel scheduler list, that still has the process that has to run. That list that's used by Task Manager, it doesn't. So a cross-view detection would basically say, are these two lists equal? Can I find, you know, a one-to-one mapping between everything in these two lists, for instance? If I don't see that, then I alert on it. So cross-view detection will take things that it knows about the way structures should relate to each other, and it'll basically look at two different things and say, does everything look the way I think it should? And there's some academic work as well. So there's Petroni and Elkim link. Those have to do with, whether you can come up with rules for your entire, well, ideally, what they're trying to do is come up with rules for your entire kernel to say, here's how every linked list and every structure relates to everything else. And if anything's ever out of order, then I think an attacker is, manipulating my data structures. So potentially you want to infer basically constraints about this structure should have the same number of elements as this structure, and this structure should never have an element which resides in this memory, etc. And as of late, there's been some interest in academic things in terms of detecting kernel object hooking, and that's those references there. So why are type 2 things going detected in real life? So the same reasons as type 1. Don't have operating system knowledge, so you need deep system knowledge to interpret the results of tools which can even detect these things. But there's also this extra thing where specifically this kernel object hooking technique, we only have things right now which detect that academically. So if you live in the assumptions of some paper and you have this environment, then you can detect the kernel object hooking rootkits. But in the real world, we don't have those assumptions, right? So they choose their assumptions so that they can detect them. So we don't have anything which can actually do a practical detection on real systems, be they Linux or Windows or Mac right now. So obviously the reason these types of rootkits are not going detected is we have nothing that in practice can detect them right now. Only heuristics, basically. So for those rootkits which specifically use kernel object hooking, the people can say, well, look at that networking structure because I know that people change those function pointers. All right, so good. I'm doing good on time. So now we're going to talk about type 3 malware. So we said before, type 3 is the type of malware which potentially exists outside the system. So the system here means the operating system. And so I said originally this referred to virtualization-based rootkits, and these are what are sometimes called ring -1 things. If you know operating systems, you have ring 3 in Intel systems is user space, ring 0, so 3 is unprivileged, ring 0, lower number, is more privileged, ring 0 is the kernel, right? So unprivileged, kernel. Now ring -1 means I'm potentially going lower in the system and I'm more privileged. So a hypervisor is more privileged than the guest operating system, right? So the hypervisor gets to decide, well, this operating system gets to run now and that operating system runs next. So ring -1 rootkits refers to using the hardware support for virtualization which is baked into newer chips from Intel and AMD. You use that support to, the hardware specifically has an easy way to create a hypervisor to virtualize a operating system. And so the rootkits basically just decide, I'm going to start up a hypervisor, I'm going to virtualize your operating system. So we'll talk about that next. Ring -2 then got sort of popular in the last couple years. This has to do with a specific processor mode of Intel chips called system management mode. So this was kind of ignored for a while until a guy said, oh, hey, I can use this to break into, I can break through the kernel protections of OpenBSD, which is, a very secure operating system. So system management mode is a mechanism in Intel chips which actually turns out to have more privileges than even hardware-based virtualization, only because when code runs in system management mode, runs in SMM, it can access all RAM throughout the system. And the reason why that's important is because your hypervisor lives in RAM somewhere, right? So if you're running VMware, somewhere there's VMware code, right? So if I'm an attacker and I live in SMM and I can access everyone's RAM everywhere, that means I can access the hypervisor. I can attack VMware. I can modify the behavior of VMware or Xen or whoever else. Right, so these got popular. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And ring -3, this term got coined for one very specific thing. I think it was last year, not this summer, but the previous summer, where Joanna Rutkowska in the Invisible Things lab were specifically attacking a new technology called Intel AMT, Active Management Technology. This is something on the system which is meant to help administrators. Basically, it can access systems even when they're off, essentially. So for all intents and purposes, your computer is off, your CPU is shut down, your operating system is shut down. This AMT has this other chip which is over there off to the side. It is still listening on the network. It still is taking power, and it can still wake up your machine, and it can still allow administrators to boot your machine so that it can take patches or things like that. But more generically, there's a variety of things which I'd call all ring -3. It's basically anything which exists outside of the CPU. So all this ring -1, ring -2, 0, 3, those all are something that's running on your actual regular Intel x86 CPU. Ring -3 is anything else that can be elsewhere. So this AMT thing, that's not an x86 CPU. It's a different chip on your motherboard. BIOS is again another chip. And you can have peripherals, like I said before, you can have malicious, peripherals stuck in the thing, which end up using DMA, direct memory access, to access all of RAM, but they're not running in the CPU. So, talking a little bit more about that. So this is Blue Pill. This is by Invisible Things Labs, and so this was specifically the ring -1 hypervisor. There's a couple other ones out there, but this was the first one presented. And so what she did was she said, if I have AMD support for virtualization and I have malware, then what my malware can do is, the operating system right here, this dotted line, the operating system is running along as normal. I've got a regular Windows box booted normally. Now we call Blue Pill the malicious software. It's basically going to bootstrap to this point where it has this VM control block. This is basically the data structure that this hardware support for virtualization needs in order to manage VMs. So basically what it's doing is it's bootstrapping to the point where it's going to call this VM run. It's basically going to be setting up the hypervisor, which is going to be in charge of the virtualized system. And then one part of it goes ahead and returns this return right there. And what that return does is it says, okay, operating system, you can resume. So right, the operating system was running here, but then we called Blue Pill. Blue Pill is doing something, right? It sets up a hypervisor, and then it says operating system, you resume. But that operating system has now resumed within a VM. So, it's not going to be visible. It's not going to have a nice VMware interface to it. Okay, the operating system is just virtualized, and it's not going to know the difference. Because the whole point of virtualization is that you're supposed to make it transparent to the operating system, right? And so you can think of this as being, you have just a regular Windows system, you're running along, Blue Pill gets installed, and now your Windows system, Blue Pill can potentially intercept, any instructions it wants, etc. And again, the usefulness for intercepting things from a rootkit or a stealth malware's perspective, if they can intercept stuff, they can check parameters, etc., and say, are you looking for my stuff? If you're looking for my stuff, it's not here. Sorry, not found. Right? And that's what enables the hiding. So that's Blue Pill. I like this picture because it reminds me of a tripod or some sort of alien. But this is actually just a state diagram from AMD's architecture manual. And all I'm really trying to say here, to quickly run you through it, is there's a couple different states. We're going to talk about system management mode. This is what the point of this is, system management mode. When you reboot your computer, you go into what's called real mode. That's this right here. All right, so reset line, real mode. DOS and old operating systems, they ran in real mode. You don't have things like kernel user space separation in real mode. So what a normal Windows will do, you start out in real mode. There's that whole boot process that I showed before, and eventually it bootstraps you into protected mode. That's where the actual regular operating systems typically run. All of your modern operating systems, they're in real mode. They've got virtual memory. They've got user space, kernel separation, etc. I'm going to skip virtual 8086 mode. I'm going to skip long mode. This is all just like this new 64-bit compatibility for new chips. But the point here that we care about is the system management mode. So I said before, it's some mode off to the side, which we consider more privileged than hypervisor. You can see on the state diagram there's only one way in and there's two ways out, but for all intents and purposes there's one way out unless you're going to reboot the machine. The one way in is this SMI, the system management interrupt. Okay, so you can see this guy can shoot out an SMI here, SMI here, SMI here. So anyways, some special type of interrupt happens you drop into system management mode. Some processing takes place. So what is system management mode? What's normally living there if it's not a rootkit? What's normally running there is low-level hardware control type things. What's commonly cited is things, for instance, to manipulate. So for instance, a temperature sensor may kick off a system management interrupt. It may say, your system's getting hot. Throw an SMI, jumps into system management mode. Code there says, okay, well, I got an interrupt that says my system's getting hot. I'm going to go talk to the fan hardware, turn on the fans, blow some air, cool the system down. So it's sort of low-level hardware interfacing kind of stuff that that manufacturers put in there to deal with their specific hardware and whatever models of laptop you have, stuff that gets stuck in there through BIOS, etc. But anyways, the point here is this is sort of where system management mode resides. It was overlooked for a long time, and then people started realizing if you can get malware in there, it has access to all of RAM. It's more privileged than everything else, basically. There's one other point I was going to make. I forgot. Well, all right, and then this is going on to the ring -3 rootkit type stuff. And this was, I said specifically, the term was coined for AMT type rootkits. Where the AMT rootkit resides is in the chipset, and the chipset is specifically it's often called the North Bridge. It's the thing which mediates the CPU's access to RAM, basically, right? So there's I don't have a architectural diagram, but you picture your CPU on top. It goes down to this North Bridge who accesses you over to RAM. There's like a South Bridge down here who's responsible for all the slow peripherals, but the North Bridge is responsible for all the fast guys, and it's responsible for talking to RAM. So the AMT stuff is actually implemented in the chip, which is responsible for mediating all the memory access on the system, the North Bridge, the chipset. And so it's a special processor. It's this ARC4. It's not just a normal x86 processor. But by doing a variety of reverse engineering, etc., they found that they could there was a function which is called by the AMT code, even when it's ostensibly disabled, it actually turns out that it was like polling. And so they found they could take this function and it would invoke their code, and therefore they could execute as an AMT rootkit. All right. So detecting each of these, there was actually a lot of hype surrounding virtualized rootkits when they first came out, so there's actually a lot of work about detecting virtualized rootkits, but a lot of it all comes down, the most generic methods is basically to exploit timing discrepancies. So if we remember back in this picture of Blue Pill, so operating system was running. Now there's a hypervisor. This hypervisor is potentially intercepting, security critical things that it wants to, hide information about. When it intercepts stuff, it's going to intercept it. It's going to do some logic. It's going to check some stuff. That takes time to do that. And so if you have some external clock that you can verify against, and well, on a normal Windows laptop of this model, it takes me, 100 milliseconds, well, nanoseconds. I don't know what the correct level is, let's say microseconds. It takes me 100 microseconds in order to perform this operation. Now all of a sudden it's taking me 300 microseconds. There's some code somewhere which is influencing me, but I can't see anything, but I can infer the existence. So a lot of the stuff had to do with timing. There's also generic mechanisms by which you can detect that you're being virtualized, because per this type of talk, compatibility is not transparency. The point she was making when she originally did this is like, if AMD did their virtualization right, well, it should be completely transparent to the things, but virtualization is not meant to be completely transparent. It's just supposed to be compatible. It's just supposed to trick the OS enough that it works. And so there's a lot of generic detection mechanisms that you can use to find virtualization, and those can potentially be leveraged against ring -1 rootkits. And also, just to make a quick point, I think I'm going to run out of time anyways. Oftentimes what people say in terms of detecting stealth malware is, let's just go lower. So if the malware is in ring 3, I'll be in ring 0, and therefore they can't touch me, and therefore I'll read their memory and they can't read mine, etc. So you see this kind of thing pervasively happening over and over. So for instance, what you see with some mechanisms to detect ring -1 is they say, well, I'm going to go to ring -2 and then I'll detect all the ring -1s. And personally I feel this, like, let's always go lower that's sort of a pointless cat and mouse game, because you're basically betting on access control and saying, well, I'm going to have some boundary between me and them, and they'll never get across it. But when you bet on access control, eventually it's going to fail anytime there's a vulnerability. So that doesn't seem like a good strategy. So for ring negative 2 things, because it's only sort of recently become popular, it turns out there are mechanisms built into the specification of SMRAM. When Intel and AMD went ahead and said we want hardware support for virtualization, they did think about system management mode. They did think, well, what are we going to do about this? How's it going to interact? So they have specified how it's supposed to work and how you can potentially virtualize the SMM as well, and so you can put it in a box as well so that it can't access all of memory. The problem is basically just that as of right now, as far as I'm aware, no commercial vendors actually put the SMM in a box. Basically, whenever a virtualization vendor can't deal with something, they just go ahead and pass it directly to hardware, right? So if they can't actually virtualize it. And if you pass SMM type events like SMIs directly to hardware, that means you're passing it to code which is accessing all of RAM, including the hypervisor's RAM. So I think, in the next year or two, we should see more things actually protecting against this type of thing. And there was even a talk at ShmooCon in 2010 this February where it was just some security researcher saying, well, this is tractable, we can implement this, and so people just need to implement it. But ultimately, like I said, I don't have much faith in just saying, well, if we virtualize the SMM, that'll protect us. So, and then ring negative 3 rootkits, or ring negative 3 malware. Ring negative 3 type 3 malware. So how do you actually detect this? So you've got some external hardware, and how are you going to actually detect that it's modifying your system? Well, theoretically, you could use other ring negative 3 detectors. So if the bad guy's an AMT, I'm going to be an AMT 2 first. And actually, the year before the AMT talk was given, there was a talk by an Intel person about using some code running in the North Bridge to detect, I believe it was ring negative 2 rootkits. So he was talking about the notion of, I'm going to be lower than them and I'm going to look at their RAM, etc. So potentially this deep watch thing, that was the Intel presentation on detecting like SMM rootkits. Potentially, if you're at the same level as them, if you can't go any lower anymore, potentially you can try to fight at the same level. If you're going to try to fight at the same level, which I think we're going to have to eventually because you can't always keep trying to go lower, there are some mechanisms. Well, okay, before I get into that, there are other things like using TPMs, the Trusted Platform Module, which does integrity checking of things. It basically, you have a hardware root of trust, and it basically keeps some keys in a chip that you can never export those keys, like the hardware is physically incapable of exporting them. And so it builds a system whereby the TPM will sign the BIOS, or sorry, not sign, it will hash the BIOS and then take that hash and put it into a register, and then the BIOS will sign the next thing and it'll put that hash into the register, and it builds this trust of each of the components, like stepping on the previous component, and it puts all those into these TPM registers, and then it signs it with this internal key, and you can present it externally. That's called an attestation system. You can use TPM things, for instance, to have like compatible BIOSes. In order for this TPM mechanism to bootstrap itself through the boot process, you have to have a specific BIOS which is TPM aware and which is able to be hashed. And so, for instance, I said before, BIOS is outside of the CPU, and therefore I would call it a ring negative 3 type thing, so if someone modifies the BIOS. So something like TPM could integrity check your BIOS in order to say nothing has changed in this. The thing is, BIOS may be ring negative 3 in that it's outside of the hardware, but simultaneously attacking it is sort of, what did I call it, type 1, because BIOS shouldn't actually be changing. So theoretically detecting BIOS is easy. Theoretically detecting AMT compromise is easy because it should be set and it shouldn't be changing. But for other things, potentially more difficult, like if you have external hardware, etc. And then just there are other mechanisms, the SWAT and SBAP. They have to do with basically if you're now at the same privilege level as the attacker, how can you make your own code, construct your own code in a very special way so that you can actually tell something about that it's running correctly based on the amount of time that it takes to run. So basically builds it, it reads its own memory, it sends back a checksum of its own memory, and for a given chunk of hardware running at a given speed, self-attestation mechanisms should always run a deterministic amount of time. So if they're not running in the amount of time that you expect, that potentially means an attacker has compromised them and has made them forge the checksum, but they can't forge this side channel if it's constructed, this timing side channel, if it's constructed appropriately. So, why are type 3 going undetected? It's sort of a catch-22. They're so low level and there's so little knowledge of systems at that level that, for one thing, you're not hearing anything about, the BIOS other than, anyone who presents stuff at conferences. You're not hearing about, BIOS rootkits in the wild. You're not hearing about any things. And, for instance, if the government finds it, they'll never tell you about it because, that's secret and we can't tell anyone about that. So don't hear about them in the wild, so it must not be much of a problem, right? So let's not look for it. And if we don't look for it, then we're not going to find them in the wild, and therefore it's not a problem. So it's a catch-22. It's circular reasoning. Even if we want to do it, right? So I gave way back in, type 0. Type 0 is very easy. Go buy antivirus. Type 1, got some good tools. You just have to understand what they're saying. When we get to type 3, we don't even have tools, really. I mean, some researchers in their own work, they've done something, but that isn't useful to anyone else other than them. So that's a big problem. And just the fact that the level of effort that would be required to develop things for specific hardware outside of the CPU is very high, and therefore they're potentially going to, if anyone goes to the trouble of making a ring -3 rootkit, it's going to be for one specific person that they're trying to attack. They can't, spread it across everyone everywhere because it's going to be very hardware specific. So when attacks are very targeted, it's very hard to find out about them. All right, so 3 minutes, final thoughts, 3 slides. So my point here, what I was trying to kind of convey, is that rootkits are not the uber elite pinnacle of malware. So, I showed you those things about most of the rootkits that are actually in the wild. They're those type 0, 1, and 2 types of malware, and I said there are detectors for all those, and you can go download them now and run them. And you can, if you have a good operating systems class, you can understand all of how these things work, because a lot of them are written by people who understand operating systems in depth, and they just say, well, I can attack that. So, like I said before, there's some of those good tools for point solutions, right? So if I want to detect on one machine, I can do that. When I want to protect my entire company, can't do that right now, and so I think there needs to be a lot more work into trying to take these known techniques for detecting things and make it into a usable tool that enterprise class users can use. And after we fix the enterprise, then maybe we can find something that mom and dad can use. Again, reiterating, the lack of deep system knowledge is going to be a problem, because it's all good and well to have a detector and you can say alert, IAT hook, but alerts have to mean something to people looking at alerts, right? And so you have to have the background knowledge to understand what does it actually mean when a given alert goes off. And right now, a big problem is not enough knowledge being spread about what it means for these alerts. A lot of the times, like I said, things can use type 0 things, not even hide, just get on the system, make yourself look like a normal system binary, and that's good enough. No one's going to find it. But there are some high-profile things which have used rootkits, so it's kind of a back and forth. Do attackers even really need to use rootkits? Because you can just hide and assume, try to look like a normal thing. But some advanced attackers have seemed to be using rootkits. And so the big point I want to convey here is, whether you're doing research here or when you eventually get jobs and do research there, or you're just working at a job and you're not doing research, you're just in charge of protecting things. There's a big problem with you can have academic techniques, you can have practical techniques for application to one system, but if you don't have techniques which are widely which are usable in real-world software that real administrators can use throughout systems, then for all intents and purposes, rootkits are not possible to detect. So they may be technically possible. You can write a lot of research papers saying, I can detect this, 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 and this rootkit class. But if defenders can't actually take some software, run it on their systems, run it across all of their systems, it doesn't matter whether you actually can detect it in theory. So that's all, and lots of references. I think I'm like 15 seconds over, so you can ask questions if you have time. I'm not sure. So. All righty, thank you.